Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us, for those who have just been admitted from the waiting room for this event, Climate Anxiety and the Environmentally Conscious Lawyer, an event in Middle Temple's Survive and Thrive series. And for those who aren't so familiar with that, I'll explain a bit more about that later on. But thank you for joining us, and also thank you for accommodating the late format change as well to being an entirely online event. I'm looking forward to it. I hope the rest of you are as well. I'm going to do some brief introductions shortly and talk very briefly about what we're going to be covering. But before I do that, the usual matters of housekeeping, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with at this stage. I think you've all been put on mute for the duration of this main portion of the session, and if I could ask that you could remain so throughout, that'll be very helpful, just so that we minimize as much as possible any disruptions from background noise, etc. There will be a portion towards the end where we're going to take questions from you. I hope some of you do have some questions for our panel, and there's a couple of ways that you can submit those. The first of which is through by email to the address members@middletemple.org.uk, or you can actually put your questions directly into the chat function on Zoom. And what we'll do is, when we get to the question portion of this session, we will go through those. The details, I think, have been already put in the chat for you to have a look at. So if you've already forgotten what that email address was, it should be in there for you to look at. But do feel free to share your questions by either of those methods. I think that's basically it for housekeeping. I'm going to provide some short introductions, then we'll get into the main portion of this talk. And then, as I say, we'll make sure we allow time for questions so that we can wrap up at around 7 o'clock. So yes, welcome to this event, Climate Anxiety and Environmentally Conscious Lawyer. My name's Michael Harwood, and I'm going to be chairing the event this evening. I'm involved variously with the Survive and Thrive series, and I'm also part of the Bar Council's Climate Crisis Working Group this year, which is my particular interest in this event. We're fortunate enough, though, to have two fantastic speakers with us who are going to be covering the issues for this session. The first of all, we have Anushka Gross, who is a psychoanalyst and best-selling author. She's written several books on a variety of subjects, but in particular around climate or eco-anxiety, including, I believe, one that actually came out very recently. So I think this is a sort of highly topical on this subject. So we're really looking forward to hearing from her, particularly on the sort of climate and eco-anxiety portion of this session. We also are privileged to be joined by Estelle Dahon KC, who is a barrister at Cornerstone, specialising predominantly in environmental and planning law. She is the co-chair of the Bar Council's Climate Crisis Working Group, which is the working group I mentioned a moment ago. And so is doing some really kind of important work in this area for the profession. So I hope, like myself, you're looking forward to hearing from them both. And as I say, if you do have any questions, do submit them in the ways that I mentioned. So I'm going to start off the session by talking about the concept of climate or eco-anxiety, as we call it, because it may be a term that people here are familiar with, but it also might be something that people are hearing about for the first time. So Anushka, I'm going to turn to you first of all. Could you set out kind of what do we mean when we talk about climate or eco-anxiety, and what do we think, some of the causes of that are?
Yeah, so I mean, it means any forms of anxiety around the looming climate crisis, and it could manifest as fear or depression or panic or all sorts of things. And the important thing about it is that it isn't, I don't think it's considered by anyone to be an illness or a disorder or something that you shouldn't be feeling. So, I mean, the causes of eco-anxiety are seen to be the crisis, not not, you know, people's neurosis or whatever. But obviously people bring their own things to it. So if you're of an anxious disposition, then if you read about whatever the things that are happening all over the world, then that can be another trigger. But it's just seemed to be a reasonable reaction to an unfolding situation.
And is it something that you think is being sort of observed more and more now, or is it just something that we understand more now?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, because the term, I hadn't heard it used much before 2019, and it's still quite a contested term. Like, lots of people don't like calling it eco-anxiety because it makes it sound like social anxiety or something that you maybe, you know, shouldn't be feeling, that, you know, you shouldn't be so worried about what people think of you when you go out, you know, for dinner, and you shouldn't be so worried about the climate, but maybe you should be quite worried about the climate. And so the term is sort of not always well thought of, and so things like you know, climate fear or green guilt or all those other terms are ones that could have become the term, but that one sort of won just in terms of what most people Google, and so that one's come out on top, and that's what we call it now.
Thanks very much. Estelle, turning to you now, why is it you think, bearing in mind, I guess our audience here are going to be drawn mostly from the legal profession, why is it you think that lawyers in particular should care about the climate crisis, or what would we say is the case for being an environmentally conscious lawyer?
I'll get to that question in a second, but I just wanted to follow on for something that Anushka was saying, because earlier on towards the end of last year, actually, I was a judge for the Human Rights Lawyers Association, where they did an essay competition. And the question was about whether climate anxiety or eco-anxiety might reach the level of a breach of Article 3 if states don't take proper action in relation to the climate crisis, which was a fascinating topic, but it meant that there was lots of discussion about the meaning of climate anxiety or eco-anxiety. And from that, I think it really brought home to me that it's a really rational reaction to recognizing the extent of the crisis that faces us, but it can be really debilitating. Yeah. It can be something that absolutely causes you not necessarily just sadness, but anger and grief and depression, like a real sort of, it's a bit like grief. And so that, from a kind of legal perspective, there's a number of things to say about that. First of all, in our own practices, we may find that we're coming across material, especially if we work in the climate area, which is the sort of material that would trigger that sort of reaction. And so it's important for those who are working in the area, and especially if they're in chambers where they are with colleagues who recognize that they're working in this area, for there to be, like there is well-being in other areas of the law, kind of support and a recognition that this is a well-being issue which should be taken seriously. But second, and this is your broader point, about why we in the law should care about the climate crisis, is that no matter what area of law you work in or intend to work in, it is inevitably going to be affected by the way in which the climate crisis is impacting all areas. So even if you're in, say, a commercial area, you are going to be faced with clients who are suddenly, for example, going to have to be disclosing their climate or the impact of their climate companies under a new set of disclosure regimes. You might be operating in family law, and it may be that the climate is impacting on the way in which family members can come or can move or can interact with each other. You may be in trust law or in inheritance law or in any sort of law where the way in which the climate impact crisis is impacting physically in the world is going to be something that your clients are affected by. So inevitably, I think it's something that is necessary for all lawyers to understand, at least in order to be able properly to address their clients' needs. And then the third thing is that lawyers very often are in a position to influence change. And there's been a lot of very interesting research that's been done, and I'll just mention two before I finish on this question. A lot of very interesting research that's been done about the way in which lawyers have an obligation, in light of the extent of the climate impact and the potential for climate breakdown, to exercise that influence in a way that addresses or helps to minimize the impacts of climate change. So there was a really important piece that was written by Justice Brian Peston, who's a judge in Australia, in the Australian Law Journal, and that was called Climate Conscious Lawyering. And then more recently in the UK, there was a keynote address given by Professor Stephen Vaughan talking about the unethical environmental lawyer. And that's fed into work by a lot of others, where they've been identifying that, for example, there may be an obligation on lawyers if they have clients who they recognize are taking action that has a very significant deleterious impact on the climate, that they may be obliged to be giving advice as to how those clients should be acting in a more climate responsible manner, and advice on transition away from those sorts of practices. So I know that's a long answer, but there's lots of different ways in which the climate as a whole, and climate anxiety in particular, can impact on the way that we act as lawyers.
That's really, really helpful, really interesting. Thank you very much, Estelle, for that. So we've sort of touched on the concept of climate anxiety, sort of what we mean by it, the sort of triggers of it. But Anushka, how does it manifest itself? So assuming that we don't necessarily know how we would recognize it necessarily in ourselves and others, what sort of things should we be kind of looking out for?
I guess the thing about it is that it's very varied. How it manifests in different people is, I mean, it's just different from case to case. And so it was funny. I mean, I've been a clinician, a therapist for 20 years, and the ways people have been speaking about it has changed quite a lot, especially maybe over the last 8 years. But the things that I was hearing first around 2015, maybe lots of people kept awake just worrying about, I don't know, coral reefs or wildfires or that sort of thing, or maybe walking into a supermarket and just looking at the produce, thinking about where it comes from, thinking about how it's wrapped, how it got there, everything, and just feeling absolutely sick. Or the main one, which is the most sort of striking, I think, was that a lot of people in their 20s and 30s coming for analysis or therapy and just saying, sort of by the by, not particularly as a symptom or complaint, that they knew they'd never be able to have children because there wasn't a viable future in which to have a child. And that was generally not being presented with any kind of affect or upset. It was a kind of demoralized acceptance of the way things were, which seemed, it's devastating to think that, people feel they have to swallow that and there's nothing to be done about it. So it's all sorts of things. But I guess one of the things that I find interesting maybe to speak about here, and if people have things to say about it, is that I was thinking about this thing called deformation professionnelle, which so whatever your job is, you sort of get warped by the things that your job makes you do. So if you're a psychoanalyst, someone says hello to you and you're like, what do they mean? And if you're a lawyer, there's apparently a sort of preempting negative outcomes or whatever, that you really have to think about all the variables and take them a bit further or whatever. And apparently, I don't know, lots of lawyers suffer burnout or get really, really stressed by those, when those ways of thinking become habitual. And the thing that you see with eco-anxiety, I think, is that lots of people start to think like lawyers in a sense. I mean, they really think about how this links with this and how this has knock-on effects for that. And there's the economy and there's the insects and there's the, all the stuff. There's the carbon, there's how human behavior, there's et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you can't kind of pin it down. You can't predict how those things are going to impact each other and how it's going to unfold. And so that way of thinking is, it's very intelligent. It means that the person's understood the problem, but it's also very difficult to live with.
Thank you. Well, I certainly wouldn't be encouraging wider society too much to start thinking like lawyers, not least for their own well-being. But that's really, really interesting. Do you know if are there any particular data or studies about how widespread sort of eco-specific anxiety is, or is it just something that is still too sort of too newly understood and for that to have been really done?
There was the research on children and young people by, oh dear, Estelle, do you remember? Carolyn, I'll remember in a minute, but it's a huge study, I think, with 10,000 young people. And they found out that absolute majority of young people were very, very concerned about the future. And you know, it's sort of in the 70s or 80% just, yeah, feeling quite demoralized. So, yeah, I don't know, but and Greenlanders found the Greenlandic Perspective Survey. That was the other one that came out in 2019, and I think that was the first survey on that subject, on the impact on human beings. And they found out that 90% of Greenlanders felt that they were seeing the impacts of climate change at first hand, and they looked at the impact on people's lives, and they found out that there was sort of increased suicide, relationship breakdown, domestic violence. All these things were escalating in relation to the other effects, like economies were changing, people couldn't travel in the same ways, the way they provided their food was different, and all this stuff was sort of noticeably changing how people lived.
Great. On a similar sort of vein then, Estelle, turning to you, how in your experience has climate or eco anxiety manifested itself sort of more specifically in the legal professional sphere, do you think?
Yes, so there's a couple of ways. Focusing on those of us who are working in the space, first of all, I think one of the key areas that it can be very challenging to accept is the feeling, the repeated feeling that it's very clear what the trajectory is on which we are currently placed. It's very clear what the outcome of that trajectory is, but the obvious actions that should be being taken in order to avoid catastrophe are not being taken. And then lawyers operating in that space may find it very difficult to identify successful ways in which to address that, either from the side of those who are seeking to challenge government inaction, or those who are advising clients and wanting to advise in relation to change. And that feeling of essentially the maddening feeling that you understand what needs to happen, but it seems that nobody who has any position of power or influence is accepting that, can be very difficult. And so I have found that there's a community of lawyers building up who are climate conscious and who essentially provide a support group. And I think talking about that and having that support structure is incredibly important. Second, in terms of the way it manifests itself in practice, is a very practical way. And this is not just in individuals who are involved in environmental law, but all or lots of people across the bar, and indeed across the solicitors profession as well, who are very conscious of their own climate footprint and are part of a drive to take really practical, sustainable steps to reduce their own carbon impact, to get policies in place for chambers and the bar more generally, for law, for the law firms and partners in those law firms in particular to lead the way. And so there's lots of practical steps that are being taken for reduction of one's own carbon impact. And then the final thing, and I think we're going to talk about this a little bit more later on, is that there's opportunity for those in the profession, obviously, to take steps which are not necessarily linked to their lawyering, but which may be informed by their lawyering. So, for example, there are a number of lawyers who are part of XR lawyers and who take direct action. There are lawyers who are involved in other sorts of protest, and there are many different ways, including other practical ways. And I think I meant when we talk about protest a bit longer, I'll talk about a couple of other more practical things then. But there are many different ways in which you can take action. And that feeling of being able in particular within a community, to take some practical steps, even if you know that they are not everything, they are something, to take those practical steps really can help.
Thank you, Estelle. Yes, as you say, we'll definitely touch on the question of the practical steps and particularly around activism and things like that. We will definitely come on to that shortly. Now that we've sort of unwrapped a little bit what we mean by eco-anxiety and how we can identify it and maybe the ways in which it manifests itself, Anushka, I wanted to ask you, for people who maybe are able to identify those aspects in themselves or other people, what are the sort of strategies or methods that you can advise people to help sort of to ease that? And that can either be in a sort of day-to-day way or in a sort of a longer term way.
Yeah, I know this is going to sound paradoxical, but you have to kind of do everything without driving yourself mad. And so there's a lot of talk about how sort of small actions and personal choices don't count. You know, it's only if you can make the government do something that there's any point in doing it. But I think that's really wrong and it's not helpful to people. So obviously, yeah, flying less, consuming less, you know, clothes, eating plant-based food, you know, all those things are real things to include in your life and can give you less cognitive dissonance. So if you know sort of how industrial farming works, then maybe don't, you know, maybe be a bit careful about those personal choices. But then you have to sort of level up. And so there's the, you know, whatever campaigning you're able to do. And I think the thing is always to use your thing. So if I'm a psychoanalyst, I can get involved with, you know, campaigning inside the world of psychiatry or whatever to have it recognized in clinics, and that if you're a lawyer you can do exactly the sorts of things that Estelle is talking about. I don't know if you saw the George Monbiot article in The Guardian today about the climate defendants not being allowed to mention the climate, and the guy who was put in jail for 8 weeks for contempt of court. But I don't know, I mean, if it's, you know, taking things like that and thinking how could lawyers respond to a situation like that. I know I'm part of Writers Rebel as well, and so we've done lots of open letters and all those sorts of things, and you never know how useful they are. But I think you kind of try everything, but you use your profession in the best way you can.
Thank you. And then Estelle, what about in your experience? What other sort of strategies you've either adopted yourself or that you've heard others use?
Yes, so I think I'll talk about 4 things really quickly. The first 2 things are 2 other amazing women, given that we've got Anushka on the call, 2 other amazing women who recently have been talking about what you can do to address climate anxiety. And the first one was, you might have seen, it was picked up in a couple of newspapers, including The Guardian, advice from Naomi Klein, who was talking about how you can address climate anxiety. And what she was saying was about marrying what you're passionate about with some sort of connection to addressing climate-based matters. So whatever it is that's your passion, it might be the law. She mentioned planning, which, you know, that made me very happy. It might be art, it might be whatever it is that you're passionate about, and taking whatever steps you can by marrying that to climate action. And then the other one was, which will be available on the BBC Sounds app, was I listened to a program on Radio 4. Now, I know for a young audience, referencing Radio 4 might not be the most obvious step. And I'm reminded actually that I went to see a comic recently called Alex Edelman, and he made exactly the same point, that he talks about stuff to do with young people, but sometimes references Radio 4. So I'm doing the same thing. But it was a program called Desert Island Discs, which is often a thing that people don't listen to, but it was the Desert Island Discs of this amazing woman who sits on the Climate Change Committee called Professor Corinne Le Quéré. And she talked really interestingly about the personal reaction to climate anxiety. And she was talking about doing what you can do, and in particular, supporting the decision makers who are going in the direction that you want. And I think that's very important and good advice. She was talking about how people are fearful, but this is the time also to be forceful and for recognizing that we can act and grasp opportunities. But then she said something really interesting. She was talking about in her own life how she's not fully vegan, but she, eats sensibly. She hasn't stopped flying. She has a daughter that lives in the United States. She still flies because that's what she has to do to see her family. And I think that is incredibly insightful and important for us to remember, that we can do what we can, but that does not mean you have to do everything. And you might not be in a position to give up flying, but you might be able to minimize.
Yeah.
So that was very important. And then quickly, the last two things that I'll mention, there are a number of initiatives within the UK legal professions, bar and solicitors, where people are coming together to declare their climate objectives and to declare themselves part of a group that is fighting to keep warming below 1.5 degrees. And there was a letter, which is now being called the 1.5 degree letter, which a number of people across the profession signed. There's another grouping called Lawyers Are Responsible, who are taking a really strong stance. And those groups that bring people together allow them to make a kind of public declaration of what their position is, I think are becoming increasingly important.
Yeah, I want the thing of being in discussion with other people who are super engaged with climate in whatever way is so important. That's such a big one. And I just remembered that just near Inner Temple, I think, is it called Essex Street? I can look it up and I can give you the reference, but there's a club called Kairos, which is a sort of environmentalist club where you can go, and they always have, an academic, maybe an economist or a theologian they had, or philosophers, or all sorts of different people who come together and have supper and have really serious conversations about the ways that, in their fields, they are thinking about climate change. And that cross-pollination, I think, is really, really helpful. And just seeing that, other people are also really suffering from it, anxious about it, but finding ways to act. Is so helpful.
Thanks very much, both on that topic. The next thing I wanted to ask about actually really quite neatly piggybacks off of what we were just talking about, which is more about sort of practical steps, and I guess specifically within the legal profession, when I've been involved in conversations about how we can make our practices more sustainable, or how the profession as a whole could be more sustainable. Sometimes some of the advice that's given doesn't always necessarily feel the most empowering, because these aren't necessarily things that we can do individually in our day-to-day lives, or it's usually just something like, well, you're encouraged to sort of use less paper. But I was just wondering, Estelle, whether in your experience there are sort of achievable steps that practitioners can take to make their practices more sustainable, sort of on an individual level, but also in terms of the conversations that they might be having within their workplaces.
Yes, there most certainly are. So just to focus on the bar, there's an initiative around the Sustainability Network, which chambers can join, which allows you access to a carbon calculator and to assist to put policies in place. And lots of chambers are already quite far down the line in terms of getting policies in place to take, as I was mentioning, those really practical steps to reduce carbon emissions. And there are actually quite a lot of resources available in different places to be able to do that, and that are particular to legal practice. There's another initiative called the Net Zero Lawyers Alliance. Shout out Wendy, I see you're on the call. Who are again putting together materials that are very practical, that are looking at how chambers and law firms can reduce their impact. Then looking more broadly at the lawyers in practice, both the Law Society and the Bar Council are currently working on guidance to lawyers in that sphere. And the Law Society slightly ahead of the Bar Council, but it's definitely something that both parts of the profession are taking very seriously. And I think it will be a significant step forward once there is ethical guidance which assists, because there's lots of areas of the law where we have a set of professional obligations, but something outside of that impacts on how we understand those obligations. And exactly the same has happened in the world of diversity, where we have a set of professional obligations, but our diversity obligations mesh with that, and how that affects how we act with clients, for example, and others, and with the court. And similarly, the climate crisis, the fact of it, the nature of it, and the impact of it mesh with our professional obligations. And so watch this space, because not only the Law Society and the Bar Council, but lots of others within the legal sphere, the International Bar Association, other bar associations across the world are coming together to work on these things and to put guidance in place. So there should be, within the next year, a really good set of guidance available to help lawyers understand how they can be more climate conscious, whatever it is that they do in practice.
Mm. And also, do you think there's sort of relating to the thing of the recycling your paper, or that it can sometimes make you feel worse if the best you can think of is to have sort of unbleached tea bags in your canteen or something? That's horrible. But thinking about where money goes in your, you know, organization or whatever, like who the pension funds are with, and whether they invest in fossil fuels, and who you bank with, and all that sort of stuff is really worth looking into. And those are quite big changes you can potentially make without too much difficulty.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's actually quite a lot of material available which gives guidance on ethical pensions, ethical banking, and it's increasingly become an area where there's an awareness that small changes can have a very significant impact.
Mm.
Thank you very much. I wanted now, if that's okay, to turn firstly to you, Anushka, on the concept of sort of being able to harness the eco or climate anxiety into something a bit more positive, and how we can do that. We've obviously talked about some of the challenges that it presents and the steps that people can take, but on a sort of, is there a way that sort of on a day-to-day or longer term basis we can channel some of those anxious feelings into something that feels like it's benefiting us?
I think so. I hope so. I mean, I don't want to be, do a toxic positivity thing, but I think the thing about anxiety is that it is quite harnessable, and in a way that's what anxiety is. It's a sort of push to action, and you know, literally that's the second dictionary definition, that you're, you know, anxious to be on time or whatever it is. Yeah, anxiety is a kind of call to do something, and so if you're anxious, you're already being pushed to act somehow, and you know, that's why you can bring about a reduction in anxiety by acting. And it's just about sort of coming up with, through discussion or through ingenuity or whatever, the best actions you can think of, the most far-reaching and the most infectious.
Thank you. And Estelle, did you want to come in on that at all?
Yeah, absolutely, because there's such a wide range of that sort of action that lawyers can take, people coming into the profession and people already in the profession. I mean, an obvious one is that people might want to dedicate some of their actual professional work to addressing the climate crisis. That's not necessarily always available for everybody. So it may be that even though you might be acting in a particular area, maybe you can support a law clinic, which is helping communities, for example, or NGOs, or working with NGOs or charities who are assisting or helping communities affected by the climate crisis. I mentioned what was said earlier by Corinne Le Carré about supporting decision makers going in the direction you want. And political lobbying is plainly crucial in order to address the climate crisis. Lawyers can be very good at lobbying, and lots of lawyers are very political in their own lives. And so that's something to think about. There's also various types of direct action. So I've talked about protests, and I'll mention that again. Plainly, lawyers and barristers and solicitors among them are able to protest, and a lot of lawyers are doing that. They're either joining protest movements like XR Lawyers or other sorts of protests, taking direct action. And that is something that I think a lot of members of the profession who are particularly aware of what's like the exigency of the circumstances are finding increasingly important. Then there's other types of local direct action. So, for example, I know there are some lawyers, and Paul Powsland is among them, who are taking direct action in their areas. For example, one of the things that Paul is doing is he's working with a group on a project to bring the river Roding back to life, re-green it, bring it back from a kind of trickly canal to a proper river. There are a lot of other lawyers who are working on an initiative by Ben Cooper Casey at Doughty Street, who set up a charity to do tree planting. You know, there can be direct local action that you can take that will have a positive impact on your local environment, and which will also address the climate crisis. Then I've mentioned on a number of occasions, there's also communities. There's also becoming involved with finding your community and getting together and talking and supporting each other. Because anxiety can be something that is really motivating, but it can also be something that sometimes feels very overwhelming. And it can be very difficult and demotivating if you are really truly feeling the extent of climate doom that sometimes comes over all of us. And that's where you need a good support network.
I wondered as well, in terms of sort of what to do with anxiety, the fact that it seems to be coming through that the other side, like the fossil fuel lobby or the government, are actually very anxious about lawyers, and that some of the actions that have been taken to stop people mentioning the climate in court, for instance, are because they're so anxious about the sympathy that the climate defendants managed to get from the judges, from all the people who've heard them, and that if there are other spaces to talk about that, whatever it is, you know, journalism, open letters, but where lawyers say, no, we really see why those people do those things, because it seems like there's a sort of worry that the lawyers are all tipping that that they all agree with the Just Stop Oil people, and that the lawyers have to be stopped. And it's good to be vocal about that actually, yeah, you might not agree that the government are right.
Absolutely. Thank you both on that. Again, this is something we've sort of already started to talk about a bit already, but I wanted to ask a sort of direct question on it as well. To you first, Estelle, which is about what more, assuming you think the profession should be doing more, but what more should the profession be doing to support lawyers who would like to have a more sustainable practice?
I think I'll just give, because I'm conscious of time, I'll just give one answer here, and that's training. I think, and it's something that the Bar Council is looking at and working on, and there are sources of training which are being brought together, but training to understand if you come from a situation where you're not as familiar with climate and its impacts, training to understand the climate crisis, the climate science, becoming and familiarizing yourself with that, and then training in adapting that and applying that within various practice areas. And in particular, there are lots of people who work with a lot of different views, with a lot of different clients. And it's important, that sort of training is important because lawyers want to retain their credibility to be able to advise clients, a very wide range of clients. And being armed with the evidence and information to do that is very important. So I think training is a big one. And hopefully that is coming soon.
Great. And yes, if time does permit later on, we'll circle back because I'm sure you have some more of those as well. But I did want to get on to the next bit, which is something again we've sort of touched on already, and I would like both of your reflections on it if possible, which is the idea of climate activism. And firstly to you, Anushka, what role do you think undertaking climate activism plays in the battle against or managing your eco-anxiety?
I suppose huge. I mean, I don't know if activism or campaigning or engagement or whatever are all good words, because if activism seems to be meaning to kind of get out on the streets, that is really brilliant for lots of people. And I mean, it's amazing what XR doctors and XR lawyers are able to do, and that they really have a voice and people do listen in terms of those actions. But that's not right for everybody. And all the things that Estelle's talking about who, you know, how you do it in your actual work, not just getting out there and, you know, breaking a window or whatever, which is a great thing to do. And it's not right for everyone.
There are some lawyers who can advise you.
And to you, Estelle, how can or should environmentally conscious lawyers engage in climate activism alongside their practices?
Well, that's kind of a very kind of broad and personal question. I think, as I've mentioned all the different things that people I know are doing and can do. And I think it's important to know maybe 2 or 3 things. First, that activism is an option for you, however it is that you want to define that word. Second, that you can be a credible, independent expert advisor, advising a number of different clients. So say, for example, in my own work, I advise across the board. I advise communities, I advise local authorities, I advise the government. And you can do that while taking whatever steps that you want to take, both more broadly in the profession and then in your personal life. And third, that we as lawyers have a particular skill, and I've mentioned this before, in terms of bringing information together and putting that information forward in a way that is persuasive. And so keep an eye out, if it's something that interests you, on the relevant sets of consultation that the government's undertaking in various areas that have an impact on climate matters. There's always a lot of it. Have a look out for the ways in which the political parties reach out to people to understand what they want and then think about their own policies. Think about what your local councils are doing, and you can bring your information and lobbying to support them. There's lots of different ways in which lawyers, our own specific skill set of bringing all that information together and putting it across in a way that is persuasive, can really work to advantage in taking certain types of action.
Yeah, persuasion seems so important. And also the thing of being kind of super legitimate or whatever. So people, you know, because of the delegitimizing that goes on and is directed at activists, it's abominable. And it seems that if you're working in the ways that Estelle's describing, it's very difficult to delegitimize you.
But thanks very much. Well, given where we are sort of time-wise, I'm keen to turn to the couple of questions that we've had in already, and if you do have one, don't forget to submit it either through the chat function or to the email address that should still be circulating in there. So I'm going to turn to the first of these. Oh yes, okay. So I think this is probably one for you, Estelle, and it touches on one that we actually were relates to one that I asked a moment ago, but it's specifically about whether you think Middle Temple and the other Inns of Court should or could do what they should or could do to assist barristers towards having a greener practice.
Yeah, so there's lots. There's kind of 2 aspects to that question. There is a lot that the Inns can do as Inns of Court. And one of the pieces of work that the Climate Crisis Working Group is doing, alongside a number of people who are actually on this call, is working with the Inns to look at practical steps that the Inns can take to support chambers, for example, in reducing their greenhouse gas emissions, because lots of chambers are within the Inns. to support moves to renewable energy, for example, moves to composting, sensible supply chains. All of that sort of stuff can be supported by the inns. And there is a varying degree of interest and support on the part of the inns. All of them are interested and supportive, but some of them are better than others, rather than we're starting from a baseline of nothing. But the inns can definitely take really practical steps. And then the second thing I suppose that the inns can do is stuff like this, which is facilitating conversation and addressing the issue and ensuring that as part of our general conversation as lawyers, we give people the opportunity to think about and engage on climate related matters. And I think that is happening, not necessarily to the extent that everybody wants, but I think that is happening and will continue to happen. Because a bit as with other issues where they became really central to the conversation, I think climate is now becoming central to the conversation that lawyers want to have with each other.
Thanks, Estelle. The next question I want to turn to, which both of you could reflect on, is from Paul Pousland, and he asks whether, in order to combat climate anxiety, should lawyers stop facilitating the fossil fuel industry and encourage other lawyers to do the same?
Yes, they should. Yes. Yeah, obviously. Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly the sort of good activism that seems very much worth a try. Yeah, that's yeah.
Yeah, so I think that is definitely something that certain members of the profession are going to want to do and can do. I think for other members of the profession, that's something, it depends on what is meant by that. If what is meant by that is stepping away from some of the obligations that especially barristers in particular find themselves subject to, in particular the cab rank rule, then I think there is a debate to be had about that. And I think that debate is being had and will be being had in the months to come, in particular this year. It's a touchy subject because I understand why a lot of members of the profession in their other areas of work feel that the professional obligation to take work from any client who comes to you if you are capable and available to do the work is an important part of ensuring that they can operate as independent experts, not identified with their clients, and not criticized as being quote unquote activist lawyers. But there are lots of other people within the profession who say, well, solicitors aren't subject to that obligation, and it's not like they are any less independent or able to advise clients. And the extent to which you're identified with your client is not necessarily the same as being obliged to take a certain type of work. The third thing that is important to understand about that is that there are also different views about the way in which certain types of clients should have access to legal advice. And I am very conscious that we don't necessarily want a situation where every entity that is maybe a fossil fuel producing entity is denied any kind of advice, including tempering advice, for example. So there are lots of lawyers who might be advising fossil fuel-based clients who are advising in a climate conscious way. And that can be an important aspect of facilitating the transition away from our dependence on fossil fuel. There's a debate to be had about that, and I think it is an important one. But the question is a complex, as many questions are in climate, the question is a complex one.
Do you think it's quite good to have those debates quite publicly so people can really see?
I agree with that. And so I think there's sort of a twin track going on here, in the sense that there's lots of debate and discussion being had within the governing bodies, and the Bar Council's Climate Crisis Working Group is one example of that. But I agree with you, Anushka, that it's important also to be having those sorts of debates more broadly. And there are lots of lawyers, barristers and solicitors who, for example, are involved with the Conference of the Parties process under the UNFCCC, and so are starting to bring events to COP. There are lots of people who think the COP process is bogus and who wouldn't want to touch with a barge pole, and then they're engaging with other sorts of events. So I think that that public discourse is important and is increasingly being had.
Mm. I wonder about something, I don't know if this is relevant really, but in my profession, you know, impartiality is also held up as an absolute ideal. It's something, you know, really precious to us a lot of the time. But all these questions have maybe come up in the last few years, like if you get a sort of murderous misogynist coming to see you and they, you know, have all sorts of whatever it is, horrifying fantasies about you, do you have to remain impartial? Or just how far do you take your impartiality? And I think in my profession, it's been really good to question those things, and a lot of the people who've discouraged us from questioning them I don't know, that's another debate that has been quite good to have quite publicly.
Yes, that's an interesting debate. There's always been a sort of broad debate amongst lawyers about where the boundaries are. I mean, we're lawyers, we love boundaries, right? We love the grey area, and that's often where we live. So there definitely is debate around that. And as I say, that's something that is increasingly being had more generally within the profession.
Thanks very much. I just to flag, we've had in the chat, I know that if you can all see it, I hope, Olivia's posted something about the Greener Litigation Pledge, which is a cross-profession initiative setting out some commitments that organisations, chambers and firms can opt into, which aims to make the conduct of litigation greener and more sustainable. I'd encourage you, certainly, if you're interested, to follow that link and find out a bit more information about it. And I know that one or two others have also posted further up in the chat some links to similar and interesting initiatives or news items that they've been involved with. So again, you know, I'd encourage you to have a look at those as well. So thank you for everybody for engaging and posting all of those really useful items in there. My next question, I mean, that I can see we've had here is I suppose it's predominantly one about the legal profession, but it could be sort of more societal, which is about the sort of the upcoming challenges to our eco-anxiety. And I guess by that we mean what are the challenges that we in the legal profession and society think we face in this area that is going to maybe put pressure on that eco or climate anxiety. And I'm happy for either one or both of you to field that.
Anushka, do you want to?
I wish I'd followed you much more closely. I'm not sure how to answer. I was hoping Estelle would answer first and then all the ideas would come.
Well, just to say, I'm posting in the chat yet another link because the climate world is nothing if not full of information to another network that you might be interested in, which is called the Green Olive Network. And that is in particular focused on young people and young people who are interested in law and policy around environment and pushing for a healthier planet. So that's something to think about. And then I should also shout out to the UK Environmental Law Association, UKLA, who have a very wide membership and who bring a kind of cross-pollination from lots of different areas that within the environmental world, so not just lawyers, and often have really interesting and important events around environmental impacts. Right, Michael, ask your question again now that I'm actually listening.
Yes, it's about kind of what's on the horizon. So in terms of what are going to be the challenges to our resilience from a sort of eco-anxiety point of view, do you think? Yeah,
I mean, that's a very good question. I think just kind of generally as human beings living in the United Kingdom, the challenges that I foresee are that we're going to have to come to terms with increasing coverage of the significant and appalling impacts of the crisis everywhere, both in the United Kingdom itself and across the world. And we're going to need, I suppose, coping strategies to be able to cope with that. Then within our own practices, I think our clients are increasingly going to be facing their own climate impacts, and we are going to need to assist them. So I can give you a very prosaic example. In planning, obviously one of the key client bases is house builders, but house builders are facing a number of sets of crises around flooding, around heating, around fire. And that suddenly becomes something around how we even build our buildings. Can we build in a way that's climate positive? Can we stop knocking down buildings and putting lots of emissions out into the atmosphere when we do that? And there's a kind of lots of issues coming at us all at once. And that's the other thing that I think is increasingly going to be something we have to deal with, is multiple kind of fronts all coming at us at the same time. And I circle back to just upskilling, training yourself, understanding the nature of what is facing your clients, so that you put yourself in a position where you can advise them and advise them well.
Yeah. It seems that in the climate campaigning world, the thing about communitarianism or whatever, this basically, it doesn't seem it's not about kind of climate deniers and environmentalists anymore. It's everybody knows that there's a real thing happening, but it's more between kind of preppers and communitarians, and can you persuade people that it's better to be kind of behave decently and get together and organize, you know, to treat each other well, rather than to get a gun and get a bunker and kind of handle things that way. And so in terms of resilience, it seems if more people have the idea that it's not going to be a kind of zombie apocalypse, but there are other ways of handling collapse, then that's a much better way to resilience.
And that is very important, because this is maybe the last thing that I'll say, which is there is going to come a point where it's likely that a consensus will build around whether we are even physically able at this point to keep temperature rise below 1.5 degrees. And I think that's going to be a real point of potential crisis for a lot of people in the climate movement, because so much emphasis is put on maintaining that temperature reduction goal, not going past that, because we know that necessarily when we go past that, that is going to have potentially catastrophic impacts on such a lot of people around the world. And there will be a crucial set of questions to answer around: one, avoiding doomism, so people check out, so people don't do anything; two, allowing political decision making simply to say, oh, well, 1.5 is gone, so, you know, what can we do? Three, around kind of defetishizing 1.5 degrees and understanding that if we've gone past it, maybe we can get back. But there's, you know, that just makes action even more important, not non-action justifiable. So in terms of the big thing that's coming in the environmental movement and in climate, I think it's how we deal with that that's going to be a big one.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Estelle and Anushka, on that. I can very quickly see that we've just had one very late question come in. I'll see if I can get to it. We've talked a lot about climate action here in the UK and the Western world. What do you say about the argument that it is somewhat hypocritical for the Western world, who have benefited from exploiting the environment for decades and have reached the level of advancement it has as a result of the exploitation of to the global south and the parts of the world that haven't had the benefit but are now able to exploit the environment for the advancement for themselves, to not do so because the West no longer considers it acceptable? And how do we approach that argument? Sorry, it's quite a lengthy one.
No, that's fine. The law has, I can answer that. The law has a very clear answer to that, and it's called common but differentiated responsibility. And it's a key principle of the Paris Agreement. And it recognizes that those in the global south, in particular, who have a tiny carbon footprint compared to those of us in the global north historically, and who need to be able to emit in order to bring their societies to the level that they want to, have a different responsibility and a different level of responsibility. And that's why the ambition for very fast decarbonisation is explicitly put, and the obligations to do so is explicitly placed on those countries that have benefited most and that are in the best position to decarbonise quickly. So common but differentiated responsibility is the answer.
Estelle, thank you very much for jumping on that and dealing with it so comprehensively. I can now see that according to my clock, it has just hit 7 o'clock. So in the interest of being timely, I will just do a very brief wrap up. The first of which is to plug just another couple of events we are running in the Survive and Thrive series. For those of you that maybe this is your first of these kind of events that you've attended, first of all, thanks very much for joining us, but also I hope that you'll come to some others. The theme is very much like this one, about empowering people, providing them with skills and knowledge that will kind of help them and benefit them both in their personal and professional lives. So please do check out some of the other ones we've got coming up. The next one is on the 28th of March. And it's called Feedback, Upskilling and Practice Management. And that's going to be held, I think, both in person and online via Zoom. So there's a possibility of coming along in person to that as well. So do have a look at it. It's on the 28th of March. So that's a plug for that event. Otherwise, it just leaves me really to say thank yous. The first of which is to everybody that's attended. Thanks for joining us, and also for engaging so much. We've had lots of really good comments and reflections and questions in the chat, which I encourage you all to have a look at. So thank you all for being so engaged. And then last but certainly by no means least, I'd like to thank both Estelle and Anushka, our two fantastic speakers, who have provided what I think has been such an insightful discussion on this really, really important topic, both for ourselves and also for our profession. So really, really grateful for your time. I've certainly taken away a lot, and I'm sure everybody else has as well. So thank you both very much for that.
Thank you.
Well, so just really leaves me to say thanks all, and hopefully see you again at another Survive and Thrive event. But otherwise, enjoy your evenings and take care.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.